The upcoming presidential elections in Syria are an arena for an early and silent battle between Moscow and its allies on the one hand, and Washington and its partners on the other hand, especially as it will be the first after the Russian military presence and the major field changes and the stability of the contact lines between the three areas of influence in Syria towards a year in the midst of a deep economic crisis, Western economic sanctions, and diplomatic and political isolation. In addition to what will happen in the first months of U.S. President Joe Biden's term, Moscow, along with Damascus and Tehran, wants these elections to be in accordance with the current Syrian constitution of 2012, away from the reforms expected in Geneva under Resolution 2254 and an occasion to turn the page and start regional and international parties to deal with the de facto situation and the legitimate government. The Constitutional Committee held 4 rounds in Geneva, and at the end of next month it will hold a 5th round dedicated to the Constitution file, unlike its predecessors that discussed national principles. But Damascus has sent a clear message that constitutional reform will not take place before the upcoming presidential elections in the middle of next year. Moscow also supported it with a clear message that there is no timetable for constitutional reform, and that presidential elections are a Syrian sovereign matter. In practice, this means that no constitutional reform will take place before the upcoming elections before the end of President Bashar al-Assad's term in mid-July, so that these elections are held according to the 2012 Constitution, which gives broad powers to the President of the Republic and inaugurates a third term for Assad, and sets criteria for running in the presidential elections. Among them, residency for 10 consecutive years before applying for candidacy, and obtaining the approval of 35 deputies in Parliament. The National Progressive Front, which includes a coalition of licensed parties led by the ruling Ba'ath, won 183 seats, including 166 Baathists, out of 250 seats in the parliament elections last July, which means that the presidential candidacy decision is in the hands of the ruling party and the coalition of licensed parties. Regarding Damascus, Moscow, and Tehran, constitutional reform is postponed until after 2021, that is, after President al-Assad wins a new 7-year term, provided that the reform will be implemented in the first upcoming parliamentary elections in 2024 unless the date is advanced. The point of contention between Moscow and Damascus is that the former wants the participation of others in running for the elections, and it sensed the pulse of opposition figures to degrees. However, there are obstacles to this, including the unwillingness of key figures to enter a cosmetic race, in addition to the presence of obstacles in the current constitution related to the necessity of establishing any candidate for 10 years in the country and the availability of a bloc of 35 deputies in parliament. Therefore, it was not a coincidence that a Russian journalist asked, during the visit of Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov to Damascus last September, about the possibility of canceling the 10-year requirement for any presidential candidate. However, Damascus's position was and remains as announced at the time by the late Foreign Minister Walid al-Muallim: presidential elections will be held as scheduled. As for abolishing the residency requirement, 10 years in Syria, this is the matter of the Supreme Elections Committee, but in principle everyone who meets the conditions for candidacy can run. For your information, the conditions for candidacy are a constitutional matter and not within the competence of the Supreme Elections Committee. Tehran supports this trend, which was expressed by Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif during his meetings with foreign visitors in recent days. He even indicated that the Syrian government is legitimate and very cooperative in the political process and constitutional reform. As for Moscow, it is still looking for mechanisms to make the upcoming elections a beginning of a Western and regional turn in dealing with Damascus in the hope of breaking isolation, contributing to reconstruction, and normalizing political and diplomatic relations. The key to this may be an amendment to the current Constitution of 2012 that allows for another color in elections. Western countries are conducting quiet consultations away from the spotlight to take a unified position on how to deal with the elections. America wants to ignore presidentialism as happened with the previous parliamentary elections, so that it will not recognize any elections that do not take place according to Resolution 2254, which stipulated elections determined by presidential or parliamentary, administered by the United Nations, and the participation of Syrians, including those entitled in the diaspora, that is, refugees. As for Washington's allies, they are divided. Some want to ignore the elections, while others suggest supporting an opposition candidate, or setting clear standards with UN approval for recognition of any elections. Some countries tried to push the UN envoy, Geir Peterson, to announce a position on the elections. However, he said that these elections did not relate to his powers stipulated in Resolution 2245, and he was content with appointing an electoral advisor. Therefore, a suggestion emerged that a process of drafting principles and criteria for recognition of elections take place, to be issued in the name of the United Nations. France had drafted a no-paper outlining the criteria for the elections. The no-paper, which Shark al-Azad obtained its text, included the assertion that if elections are free, fair, and neutral, and are held in a safe environment where all groups of the Syrian people, including the displaced and refugees, can participate in them without hindrance, the upcoming elections in Syria have the actual and real contribution to establishing stable and legitimate institutions in the country as an integral part of the broader political process under 2254, and they could also be one of the main elements concerned with the permanent settlement of the current conflict. In the absence of these conditions, they can be manipulated in an attempt to restore the illusory legitimacy of the Assad regime in the post-conflict phase, while deterring Syrian refugees abroad from thinking of returning to their homeland. Regarding this document, the provisions of International Resolution 2254 may form the foundations and guidelines that will guide future discussions on elections, in order to ensure that elections will not be considered legitimate unless under the supervision of the United Nations, and in accordance with the highest standards of transparency and accountability. International, and where all the sects of the Syrian people, including the displaced and refugees abroad. Accordingly, the document, which is currently subject to amendment, set strict conditions for acceptance of the election results. And she suggested that the Western message be based on 4 conditions in order to gain legitimacy, namely: first, establishing confidence-building measures on the ground with the aim of creating a safe and neutral environment before, during, and after the elections, in order to ensure that the electoral process is credible under adequate security conditions while protecting the rights of all parties. And this condition is the most important: holding the elections in an environment that does not have these conditions will not be credible, and will not deserve international support, or the participation or supervision of the United Nations. Secondly, the existence of strong guarantees that confirm the participation and access of displaced persons and refugees to the polling stations, in light of the presence of 12 million external refugees and internally displaced persons in Syria. It is extremely important that all Syrian citizens in the diaspora be able to vote while also having the right to run in elections. Third, the easy legal and practical conditions for conducting plural voting, that is, the existence of guarantees for open and multiple voting means the existence of appropriate electoral reform, including the reform of Articles 84 and 85 of the Syrian Constitution, and the formation of an independent committee under the administration of the United Nations to review nominations for elections. Fourth, the United Nations supervision of the elections ensures that the electoral process is strictly impartial. Accordingly, the United Nations must direct and monitor the entire electoral process, reforming the election law, establishing electoral rolls, polling, voting centers, appropriate electoral infrastructure, registration, etc., in order to demonstrate its full credibility. A British diplomat had said, based on Resolution 2254, it is clear that the new constitution should be drafted before the start of new elections. As mentioned, the recent Russian statements indicating the possibility of separating the presidential elections from the Constitutional Committee raise a deep level of concern, as they harm the political process and the consensus of views agreed upon in this council. Western countries refused to recognize the parliamentary elections in 2012, 2016, 2020 and the presidential elections in 2014, and the European Union linked its full readiness to undertake the reconstruction of Syria with the existence of a comprehensive and real political transition process based on Resolution 2254. Washington imposes sanctions under the Caesar Act on Damascus and political and diplomatic isolation over it, until it plays a positive role in implementing Resolution 2245, expelling Iran, and implementing other demands. The upcoming presidential election is the number 18 since 1932, when the first presidential elections took place. Although the elections were held under the weight of the French Mandate, they were the most diverse in the history of Syria, as 6 candidates competed for the presidency, which represented the largest number of contestants in presidential elections in the country's history. 2 of the contenders were former rulers of the country, Hakti al-Azam and Subhi Barakat, and 2 of them were the current and former prime minister at the time, Taj al-Din al-Hassani and Rida al-Rakabi. The remaining 2 candidates later became the first and second president of Syria, Muhammad Ali al-Abed and Hashim al-Atassi. Syrian historians did not attach much importance to the 1932 elections as they took place under French rule, in return for greater interest in the 1955 elections, in which Shukri al-Quwatli and Khalid al-Azam competed. As for all the remaining elections, they were either referendums or elections held by a competitor in which no one could face him. The diversity and competitiveness that characterized the 1932 elections reveals the extent to which the nascent democracy in Syria was promising in the 1930s, and how it would have prospered had it not been for the military coups and counter-coups that swept the country starting in 1949. The upcoming presidential elections in Syria are an arena for an early and silent battle between Moscow and its allies on the one hand,